And welcoming our presenter, Dr. Joanne Forbes.
Thank you so much, Yvette. And next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to begin with a disclaimer, which is the title of this workshop, as you just heard, is Are You a Non-Peer Supervisor? And this is what the research tells you. The disclaimer is what we learned in this research is also interesting and applicable if you are a peer supervisor. So for those of you who are peer supervisors or peer supporters in the room, you are in the right place. I'm delighted to have you here. What we're going to talk about today are some findings from research that was done in 2020. And it was a qualitative study, which basically means I had the delightful experience of speaking to peer support workers across this country who were supervised by non-peers. And as a result of those conversations, we've learned a lot. And part of that is how clinical supervision and peer-informed supervision differs, some of the challenges, what works, and what the takeaway critical elements are. Next slide, please. Yeah, we already said that, so we're going to move right on. So why are we talking about this? And not to put anyone to sleep in the audience who've heard this before, I think we often have to circle back and realize that although it's been many, many years since peer support was recognized as a best practice by CMS, we still have a long way to go, as this important supervision summit demonstrates, to really get our arms around this. So, as you know, in 2007, Medicaid funded peer support services, thanks to our sisters and brothers and colleagues in Georgia who had that idea and got a Medicaid waiver. And as they say, the rest is history. But what was interesting about the guidance that CMS gave, it indicated that supervision should be provided by a competent mental health professional as decided by each state. You know, Medicaid is a state share funding source. So the states do have a lot to say about what happens with it. When I saw that, because I've been working in peer support for a very long time, when that came out, I was, to use the phrase, gobsmacked, because I knew where this was going to go. And indeed it did. As I did national training during those years across the country, the interpretation of that guidance by virtually every state meant that the supervisor was in all likelihood going to be someone with a license, whether that is a psychologist, a social worker, a nurse, a mental health therapist. There's different titles in different states. So what that means, and what we're going to talk about today, is that because of that interpretation, which is held on for the past bazillion years, non-peer supervisors who supervise peer support workers or family peer advocates are really familiar with clinical supervision. That's what supervision means to them. Next slide, please. So what does that mean to us? What is non-peer supervision? I know everyone in this room can answer this. It means that you have not lived experience yourself. You're not a peer support worker. You are someone who has expertise in another professional arena. And that's wonderful, because we need all hands on deck. But it does create some challenges. Next slide. So it means, as I said, that what is understood in that realm, and I can speak to that because somewhere long, long ago and far, far away, I got a master's in psychiatric nursing. So clinical supervision is how I was raised, if you will, for many years. Technically, it means a senior member of a profession provides supervision to a junior member. And the purpose is really to enhance their professional functioning, to role model behaviors, monitor the quality of services. You heard a lot about this from Peggy Swarbrick, my colleague from Rutgers, in her keynote. It's an apprenticeship model, and it's been around from the beginning of time. That's how we've all learned in our professions. There was a time when schools and education and academia were not readily available. So if you wanted to learn how to do something, you found someone who knew how to do it, and you apprenticed and you followed them and you learned it. So clinical supervision and all supervision really serves that purpose. Next slide. But here's where the roads begin to diverge, because clinical supervision is predicated on academic credentials, that license that I mentioned earlier. It tells the state, it tells the customers, if you will, that the person with that license has met certain standards. And it's documented by an authorized body, and it's very important. But clinical is also coexisting with this idea of treatment. That is frequently what the focus is of the academic training and the credentials. It's a word, fancy word for helping people. Next slide, please. Lived experience has its own credentials that are equally important and equally memorable. And most academics remember when they graduated and they threw their cap up in the air and they got done. For those of us with lived experience, those experiences are equally memorable. And we should all be given caps to throw up in the air as we've gotten through them. But they differ in many, many respects from those licensed other professional interventions, because they can involve dual relationships and personal self-disclosure, and they focus on empowerment, and they role model hope and recovery. These are phrases that are familiar to non-peer professionals, but they're familiar because they've learned about it, perhaps. Next slide. So just take a minute, if you will, to put in the chat some of the challenges you've experienced. If you are supervised by someone who does not have lived experience, and you're a peer support worker who does have lived experience, and you've been hired to share your experience, strength, and hope with others who are on their journey to recovery and on their journey to having a full and meaningful life. And if Yvette is still with us, I'm going to ask for some assistance in reading some of what goes into the chat. Yvette, if you wouldn't mind.
Absolutely.
So otherwise, you're going to see me squinty-eyed with my nose on the computer screen, which, trust me, is not pretty.
All right, so we don't have any chats coming in yet, but I'm sure they will come in fast and furious.
Okay. Well, I'm going to move ahead in the service of time. And again, if you have experienced challenges being supervised by a non-peer supervisor, we'd love to hear about them.
Okay, so there are a few coming in. So how to support a peer who is triggered by the work and struggling to complete tasks. Someone else said a supervisor not knowing what to expect from documentation. And this is a clarity question. To clarify, this is a question directed to people with lived experience.
Correct. Although I'm certainly interested in what those of you who are non-peers have experienced as challenges as well. We'll get to that probably later in this presentation. So next slide, let's keep moving.
Mm-hmm.
So clinical work and peer work, how are they the same? Because they are. We all come to our spaces of work with the same intention, because that intention is to help people and to promote recovery. Now, there are some non-peer professionals who are still grappling with that notion of recovery. I'll share with you, I do some consulting work in local hospitals, and every July, the baby docs, that's what I call the 12-year-olds who now graduate from medical school and are assigned as interns in the psychiatric units throughout New York City. So the baby docs come on board, and I'm delighted to see them because I see them as the future. And, I interact with them and I build relationships with them. And then I quickly move into this idea of recovery. And I give them the research that Courtney Harding and all of her colleagues did bazillions of years ago. And the research been replicated 10 to 12 times around the world with the same results. And those results prove that people with the severest mental illness, and I hate that term, but I'm going to use it because they do, can and do recover. And when I say that to the baby docs and I give them the articles, a day or two later, they come back and they say, the problem with that research is everyone was misdiagnosed. Okay, it's a little disheartening, but we'll get there. What I do know is these same baby docs and these same non-peer professionals, in their heart of hearts, want to help people move on and get better. So next slide, please. But they're different, right? We know how they're the same. We're all there in these spaces to do what we can, but they're different in style and substance. And they're often different in the goals that are closest to the hearts of the people who hold them. Clinicians, because of the organization they work in, are often motivated by, I'm going to say the words, stabilization, community tenure, lack of repeat hospitalizations. And those are important to everyone. I've not met someone with mental health challenges who've said, all I want to do for the rest of my life is cycle in and out of the inpatient ward. All I want to do is sit in my house and wonder how this happened to me. No, of course not. But frequently, those of us with lived experience understand that to get there, sometimes you have to focus on what's right with you and your strengths and your dreams and your goals and what you wanted in the future. That next slide is perfect. Go right ahead. So here, when you look at them side by side, lived experience has really been there, done that. Non-peer academic training, I learned about it. Lived experience, there's a mutuality. Boy, I understand you in ways that I don't even want to talk about. Academic, frequently, there's a power differential. I have expertise. I am here because I know what I know, and I'm going to use it to help you get better. Dual relationships. This is a bugaboo, as we all know, because in clinical training, boundaries are very important. And I'm not saying boundaries aren't important in lived experience, but there's a different emphasis. Lived experience emphasizes choice. What do you want? Does this work for you? Where clinicians are tasked with developing treatment plans, allegedly in conjunction with the person that they're working with, but frequently we know that doesn't happen. And again, peers actually are the face and the role model of recovery. They've done it. Clinicians frequently are tangled up in what we call provider responsibility, because when things go south, it's not unusual for the providers to be blamed. Next slide, please. So in some ways, what I'm talking about is this recovery-oriented model versus the medical model. The medical model has been around for centuries, and it's understandable. This is not a criticism. The medical model is focused on what's wrong. Again, I don't know a lot of people who say, I'm going to go to the doctor today because I don't know what else to do and I'm bored, so I'm just going to go hang out in the doctor's office. If any of you do that, I'd like to talk to you afterwards because that's interesting. And as I approach retirement, maybe that's something I'll do. But, when do we go to a doctor? When do we go for professional help? We go when things aren't working. We go when something's broken. And something's wrong, right? So from that perspective, yes, stability, community tenure, lack of symptoms, that makes sense. You came to me complaining about A, B, D, C, and D. I've helped you get rid of A, B, C, and D. I don't know what's your problem. But a recovery orientation takes it further. Recovery orientation kind of answers the question, well, now what am I going to do? I've been tangled up in my challenges. I've been tangled up in all the sequelae that came with that. Maybe I dropped out of school. I didn't get to college, or I tried and I failed. My relationships aren't working. My family doesn't know what to do with me. All of that stuff. A recovery orientation focuses on your dreams, living with meaning and purpose. That has nothing to do with the trauma and the challenges and what you've overcome. Next slide. And I talk about all this, which I know is familiar to you in the audience, because I want you to understand that what we're doing here today at this important summit and what you'll continue to do in the years to come is really working in this transition. We're still transitioning from a medical model to a recovery-oriented model. We're still transitioning by adding peer support workers as professionals to a team of workers who have more of a shared language and understanding. So both peer support workers and supervisors do this work in this transition. And let me tell you, having done this work, it's a bumpy ride because we're not all on the same page. We're frequently coming from very different understandings, and that's okay. Just recognize where you are and take it in. Next slide, please. So as I said earlier, adult peer support specialists, family youth peer advocates, you are the faces and champions of recovery. You show what it looks like, what it can be, not only for folks who are struggling to get there, but also for many, many professionals. If they've been around any amount of time, they suffer from what we call the clinician's illusion. And what that basically means, if you only work with people who are heavily challenged, then that's all you know. And again, people who have moved into recovery gone back to work, had families, built relationships, become advocates. They have their own world that they reside in. The clinicians are still working with the folks who are coming in saying, I don't know what's wrong with me. So it's critically important for all of us to be able to share space with people who've been there, done that. Because that's the only way you're going to understand what it is. I share this analogy frequently. Some of you I know in this room have heard it, but I'm going to do it again anyway. Because when I started my research, I was so disturbed by this recommendation of non-peer licensed professionals, kind of required, recommended strongly to supervised peers. I was disturbed by the lack of fit. And it was so clear to me, and I felt very alone at that time. It was clear to me because I know, for example, if you're building a house and you have all kinds of tradesmen, right? You have framers and you have sheetrockers and you have electricians and you have plumbers. If you're the general contractor, the one who oversees all this, how likely is it that you're going to ask the electrician to supervise the plumber? You're not. I mean, God help us if you do, but all right. You know, when you've done something for the first time, when I became a parent for the first time, all of a sudden, all my friends who hadn't had children yet were less important to me. I needed people who had had children because I had no idea what I was doing. So it's like that. That's the importance of folks with lived experience. And they're role innovators. They're going to change things. They're what Pat Deegan calls, right, those creative disruptors. And they're advocates for the change that needs to happen in mental health. And I say that not because everything's wrong, but because we can always get better. We can always do it better. We can always change what's not working. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to do with you for the next half hour, perhaps, is really talk about the findings of the research. And again, I'll share with you, having been in these spaces for a long time, I recognized early on, if I wanted an important seat at the table, I was going to have to put my big girl panties on and go back to school. And I did. And even though we encourage each other, you know, if you're not invited to a seat at the table, bring a folding chair. It sometimes helps when that folding chair, it's got some creds. And we're still in a space and a time where those academic credentials are important. So I am humbly here with you today, having gone back to school and did what I had to do, including this research, which was the basis of my dissertation. I'm not sure I'm recommending this, having gone through it, but I'm just saying it, okay? So I talked to people who were working as peer support workers across the country. And because they were still working, we know something about these people, right? They're still working. And part of that is when I asked them about their experiences being supervised by a non-peer supervisor, to a person, they liked their supervisors. Good news, everybody. They liked their supervisors. But unanimously, all the people I spoke to, peer support workers wanted a supervisor who was a more experienced peer worker. And of course, you can understand that from what I just said. We all look to people with experience to learn that experience. Next slide, please. The 4 findings I'm going to go over with you are the following. And there's a lot packed in underneath that. I'm not going to get to all of it today, but I'm going to give you at least the treetops. So what can you learn from this research? First and foremost, if you are in an organization that has some experienced peers, please figure out how to promote them into supervisory positions if they want to and they're willing to. But beyond that, supervisor attitude is probably the most important determinant of success. Role integration challenges, I don't have to tell you, still exist. All these years later, still exists. Trauma-informed techniques belong in supervision. There's a lot of talk about that. That trauma-informed stuff has been around for a good 20 more years. Moving it into supervision is sometimes something you need to really think about. And building supports and networks for everyone, peers and supervisors, is crucial. So I'm going to dig down a little bit. Next slide, please. All right. So when I talk to people who said they liked their supervisors, it was pretty positive, even though they would prefer someone with lived experience, this is what they told me. And Dr. Swarbrick really did a masterful job talking about the details of this, but it's always worth repeating. It's that listening, the availability, the mutual goal setting, that transparency, that disclosure, that shared responsibility and realism, that concrete realism. You know, here are our lofty goals. Here's what we have to work with in terms of our resources and our time and our energy. What can we really accomplish together? All of those elements make up a positive supervisory relationship. Next slide. No matter what supervising you're doing and who you're doing it. We're going to talk later about how to address the flip side of what I shared with you, those staff attitude problems, the lack of role clarity, the need for trauma-informed supervision, and how you build a facilitative environment. Next slide. All right. I'm going to spend more time on this probably than anything because it's one of those things that we assume, that we go, oh yeah, of course. The supervisor's attitude is essential. Now, how often do you think about the attitude that you carry around with you? Probably not very often. I know I didn't. I just, it's part of the package. I'm blonde. I have an attitude. I'm from New York. All right. So, but it's important to reflect. And as Peggy Swarbrick said, that self-reflection. What am I bringing to this table? And what I discovered is that for many non-peer professionals, they didn't have a voice and a choice. Someone in administration said, we're hiring peers. Everyone's hiring peers. I want a peer. It's like when Krispy Kreme donuts came out. You didn't know if you liked them, but everyone was having one. You were going to get one. It's kind of, what happens frequently in organizations. I don't know what to do with a peer support worker or a family peer advocate, but I know I want one because everyone's getting one. It must be important. And so the team of non-peers, frequently without voice and choice, have this person show up on their doorstep. And frequently, what do they know about people with lived experience with mental health challenges? They know that clinician's illusion. And so that attitude is frequently expressed in very subtle, sometimes behavioral, not verbal ways, but it's an attitude. I've heard people say in the staff room, how are the crazy people going to help the crazy people? Hurts my mouth to say that out loud, but I've heard it. I've been in those rooms. So the attitude that you bring makes all the difference. And to be fair, peers have their own attitude. A lot of peers have not always had the best experience in mental health systems that are overcrowded, overworked, underpaid, you know. And so they may be looking at the professionals on the team they're assigned to with their own baggage. But if the supervisor's attitude reflects respect for the peer role, how does that get expressed? It got expressed in my research by people saying to the peer, I have no idea what you do, but I know you do, and I got your back. So you do what you do. That's respect. That's humility. That's respect. That's acknowledgement. That's empowering. If you can demonstrate that respect along with what I call positive, non-judgmental communication, what does that mean? That means you check your stigmatizing and microaggression behavior at the door. And if you don't know you're doing that, because sometimes it's just in the culture and you don't even realize what you're doing, give the peer permission to tell you about it when you meet in supervision. And so that your communication is cheerleader, positive, we've got this, we're going to figure it out. When you combine that respect and that attitude of positivity, what you're allowing is the autonomous functioning of the peer in the peer role. You know, you got to check your anxiety at the door. Clinicians worry about everything because, right, they're responsible for everything, even though we know that we can't make people change. There's a little bit of us that think, yeah, I can. That's why I went into this field. I'm going to make them change for the better. Check that at the door, okay? Because your anxiety is all rolled up in that. Let the peer function with your support and guidance, given what your environment is designed to do, but respect that they know what they're doing. And if they don't know what they're doing, you're the first person they're going to look for. Next slide. Okay. As a supervisor, it is imperative on you to model respect for the peer role. And it can be uncomfortable because now you are a dyad. It's you and the peer worker, or maybe you and two peer workers. And then there's the rest of the team. It's up to you to really buffer those stigmatizing attitudes from your fellow team members and call them out, which is frequently not popular, but I trust that those of you who've gone into the helping professional have exquisite communication skills, and you're going to figure out how to make people aware that they're being stigmatizing. And you're the one, as I said, you're going to be the cheerleader. You're the one that's going to say, you know what? This is wonderful. This is working. This is making a difference. And you're going to advocate all the time to include the peer, family peer advocate, whoever it is you have on your team, into all the team activities. I can't tell you how many people told me that there would be a team meeting and the peers were never invited. Nor was any discussion held with the peer about what was going on. It's a very isolating place to be in. And we know about recruitment and retention issues. Some of it stems from that feeling of being very alone and very not wanted and very different. Next slide, please. So the second important finding, again, there are no surprises here. Many of you in this audience could have presented this equally well. Figuring out how to include the role of a peer into an already existing team is a significant challenge because you have to rethink how you think. Not easy to do that. And the challenges are from top to bottom. What are they supposed to do again? You know, how many times in your experience have you added a new member to the team and even seen the job description that HR put out? I mean, I'd like to think that's changing. I'd like to encourage when you're adding a new member to the team, find the job description, because that's what's going to give you role clarity. I'm going to talk about role adaptation a little bit, practice boundaries and peer drift. Next slide. Because I was saying, you know, frequently these job descriptions were copied and pasted from places, or they were someone's idea of what peer support work should do. And they're frequently nowhere near what peer support can do. I really encourage you to sit down with your hired peer support worker, give them the job description and say, can you fix this? Can you change it? What does it look like from your perspective? And you'll also understand the role if you provide support for that autonomous functioning and not get anxious when you overhear a peer disclosing stuff about themselves to one of the people that you work with. That is their job. Is it very different from what you might have learned as a different professional, as social worker, psychologist, psychiatrist? Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I'll share an anecdote with you. I was doing some training in Rhode Island, and it was a mixed room of peer supporters and non-peer supervisors. And one of the peer supporters shared that she was dual diagnosed and was someone who went into the 12-step rooms on a regular basis. And that month was the speaker at one of those important meetings. And as a speaker was sharing her experience, strength, and hope. And in the door comes a group of individuals who are also dually diagnosed and were clients in the clinic where she worked. She finished her presentation, but the next day she went back to her supervisor, having been given the policies around boundaries. She knew this was a little wonky, very professional word, wonky. Didn't know what to do, went to her supervisor. The supervisor said, well, you can't go there anymore. You can't go there. You can't be in the same room with people that you're working with. Really? That's how it gets expressed. That's how, you know, this lack of role clarity gets expressed. And we could do a whole presentation on this issue of boundaries. I'm not going to touch it much other than to say, I play golf with my periodontist. He's never gone running off the greens when I showed up. Just saying. So, role clarity also is handled by that mutual learning that, again, my colleague Peggy spoke so eloquently about. It's really co-learning, learning from one another, because the side of the desk that many peers have been on when they've worked with their own issues with the clinician is different than the side of the desk the clinician sits on. So that sharing of how you see what you do is really important. And this is where role adaptation comes in. And I usually get a lot of pushback on this, but I'm a big girl now and I can take it. What do I mean by role adaptation? I learned this from one of the people I interviewed who was very successful. I think he was in Texas, very successful in his role as a peer support worker, as a advocate, if you will. And what he said is, I got myself invited to team meetings and I listened for a long time. And then I realized I had information about folks that the rest of the team did not have for lots of reasons, right? Part of it is what they focus on. Part of it is what they're willing to hear and have time to hear. This peer knew things like where this person wanted to live if they could get a chance, things that were important to the team. And so he called it role adaptation because he didn't share everything he knew about this person, although it would have been important for the full team to know them. But he cherry-picked the stuff that helped the team realize its goals. To say things like, oh, I didn't know so-and-so had an aunt that would take him in. I was afraid they'd have to stay here with us. I'm talking an inpatient, for weeks while I tried to find a place for him to live. Oh my God, I wish I'd known that. Well, now you do. It's that kind of conversation. Next slide, please. Forgot this was here. So that's what role adaptation is. It's not necessarily peer drift, or it's not being co-opted. It doesn't have to look like that. It just means that when peers are included in all aspects of team functioning, it allows the peer to prioritize information, to share the stuff that they didn't know was important before they listened to what the team was trying to achieve, hopefully in partnership with the client or the consumer or the other peer. It really increases mutual understanding. The same person in Texas said, oh my goodness, the mystery is gone. Now I get it. I never got it all those years when I was on the other side of the desk, and I didn't get it for several weeks when I started working here. But now that I'm included, I feel I really can make a difference. Next slide, please. I'm going to ask you to put in the chat, and I'm going to ask Yvette to be my monitor, please. If you have or are experiencing that kind of role confusion in the place where you work, what tips and techniques can you share with the rest of the audience? And yes, too, I just caught that chat. One of the important things to talk about as a peer when you're walking alongside another peer and you're in your professional capacity. As a professional peer, it's important to be transparent that you are a member of a larger team. And in that role, you will be sharing information that's important.
Mhm. And Joanne, to your point, there are some comments in here, direct communication and open communication, to explain to the office or other staff what the peer can't do, like only meet with folks on voluntary basis. So that's in there as well. Those are the comments that have come in.
Yeah, that's real important. Not only what you can do, but what you can't do.
Mm-hmm.
Like you're not the medication police, you're not the compliance officer, you're not the person who's going to enforce suggestions that the person that you're working with is adamantly opposed to, you're the connector, you're the interpreter, you're the negotiator, if you will.
Mm-hmm. And so other comments are that they're mandated reporters, frequent reminders are refocusing on the peer role and model so you don't drift away from the role expectations, and giving peers forums to share the work they do so that the rest of the team understands.
Yes. A very important technique that's been shared with me again across the country is creating opportunities for peers to present in a mini conference at the organization what it is they do. Let them create that in-house training and bring colleagues of theirs with them for support to really address to non-peers. This is what we do. This is what we are not supposed to do. And the other really important resource for this, it's come up last week, it's going to come up again, is the National Practice Guidelines for Peer Supporters and Supervisors that can be found on the NAPS website. It is a very important guide. It's concrete. It tells you this is the peer value, this is how it gets expressed by peers, and this is how it gets supported by supervisors. It really, put it under your pillow at night. Keep it next to your coffee cup. It really is a wonderful, wonderful resource. Next slide, please. The practice boundaries bugaboo. Okay. This is so interesting to me, having come into peer work before the professionalization of peers. Peer work started in self-help rooms where folks who were not finding everything they needed in the rooms and clinics and places that were provided to them came together with each other to learn and to grow. A long, really important history. And if you don't know that history as a peer, or if you don't know the history as a non-peer, I suggest that you take some time to learn it, because the pioneers in this were on the same kind of page, if you will, of passion and advocacy as you probably know more about civil rights, women's rights. This was, back in the day, this was the ex-patient consumer survivor movement. And they were not kidding about survivor, because it wasn't that long ago that the tools that professionals had at their ready were really not helpful. And I'm being kind, really not helpful. So there were a bunch of people who said, I am not going there again. We can figure this out. And so the boundaries were not needed. They were friends, they were colleagues, they went to camp together, they went to conferences, they marched. We used to have a picnic for parity here in New York City every spring when peers were trying to get insurance parity. So the evolution of boundaries is still that. It's an evolution. And I encourage you to have the discussion. Peers need to know what the policies and procedures are in your organization, and also need permission to begin to understand how to navigate that safely and within the confines of your policies and procedures. Those policies and procedures may get a little softer. It's an important issue. Again, it could be a conference all of its own. I'm going to plug the National Practice Guidelines again, but you need to have the conversation, because there are differences in relationships and values and perspectives. And as I illustrated with that anecdote about the dual diagnosed in Rhode Island, it can create multiple challenges that need to be addressed. So next slide, please. The third finding probably doesn't sound surprising, but there were some surprising twists, if you will. And what I'm going to talk to you about is, first and foremost, the use of self in this way, in this personal self-disclosure, in sharing stories about a journey that may not have been a trip to Disneyland for much of the time. That use of all of that, that remembering of all of that, is a very different experience for people with lived experience. The lived experience professionals, it's different. I've heard people say, the other professionals have a desk that they can hide behind. And they don't choose to share some of their darkest, difficult moments. It's not their job necessarily. It's not how they were trained. So, understand that difference, that use is tiring. And so what we understand is compassion fatigue, burnout. Expect it to happen sooner, and it's more likely to happen in peer supporters and family advocates. It just is. So you won't be surprised. You'll inquire about that. Because again, when we're talking retention and recruitment, we all know in every profession, burnout is when you head for the door. When you know you cannot do this anymore, you've got nothing left. So just realize that peer supporters may get to that point sooner than you think. Moral injury. Doing some research now with a colleague on this. When it was first brought to my attention in these interviews I did, I was like, huh? But moral injury is a real thing in healthcare. We're seeing the literature explode, obviously, since COVID. And moral injury basically is when you're forced to witness or participate in something that goes against your fundamental values and morals. It happens in peer support work because the values can be different. The expectations are different. There was a person who had to leave their employment in an emergency room because they could not witness the seclusion and restraint practices that were going on every day, all the time in that emergency room. I won't tell you what state, but just believe me, it was, and she was the one who said, it's a moral injury. I cannot do it. I can't witness it. I cannot participate in it. I'm out of here. And of course, preventing re-traumatization and self-care. Next slide, because I'm sure I'm going to go over this again. It's that thing, you tell people what you're going to tell them, you tell them, and then you tell them what you told them. I'm trying to be good about that. So I did cover this. So I'm going to ask you to go to the next slide, please. I even covered this. I'm so proud of myself. The other thing I just want to add to this is the other phrase that's popping up is moral distress. And so that may be what you're going to witness as a peer supporter, that you're starting to feel distress about what you're participating in. And it may not cross the line to injury. When you're in the injury arena, it's kind of almost too late to make an intervention. Although I will say debriefing frequently helps. Next slide, please. So trauma-informed supervision accepts the possibility of moral injury, compassion fatigue, and is always keen to prevent re-traumatization. If the peer tells you, peer support worker, family peer advocate tells you that the last intersection they had with a care team was they themselves being medicated forcefully, restrained, involuntarily, I mean, there's a whole list of things, and I'm not going to be able to spend a lot of time on it. You know, those are traumatizing. And to witness it with the person that you're working with the team, is re-traumatizing. So you folks know this. I'm not going to dwell on it, except to say this is where self-care is so important. And I will acknowledge, you know, we're talking about two things, supervision and self-care, that as far as I know from being an administrator running community services and clinics for over a decade, we didn't get the bill for that, you know? So I understand these things are easy for us to say. It's another thing for you folks on the ground, trying to keep the place open and the doors open to really implement. Self-care is important. It has to happen at work as well as outside of work. And figuring that out is always a challenge. Next slide, please. Re-traumatization, I think you folks know that is very individualized, that the data at this point indicates that it may be as high as 70% of individuals who have mental health challenges also have a trauma history. There's no surprises there. If you don't know if you have a trauma history, take the ACEs test. It's online, adverse childhood experiences. That little, I think it's 10-item thing, you may be surprised. I've said this already, you know, the duties and the interactions on the job can trigger memories of overwhelming past experiences that are totally outside of your awareness. So be aware that it's outside of your awareness and you may get triggered. So if you're having a really bad day and you don't know why, that could be what's going on. Next slide. What helps? These three things. The awareness that trauma is often outside our awareness. Have no idea, can be triggered by sights, sounds, smells. I don't need to lecture you. I'm sure you've all had trauma training. I'm just restating it. And what is the most important thing about trauma-informed care is feeling safe. Am I safe? Am I safe in supervision? Can I trust you? And address it. If you think you're getting re-traumatized, or if you think the person you're supervising might be getting re-traumatized, you know, you do that delicate dance and you see if you can address it. Next slide. This finding is all about the necessity of providing what I call a supportive environment. Why is it critical in peer supervision for supervisors and for peer supporters? It goes back to that sense of isolation that I mentioned earlier. We're probably a long ways from having as many peers on a team as you have non-peers. And it is only when that balance is struck that the need for support is diminished. It will never go away. We're human. We're that species, that we're social. We need other people. We need support. But I will say in the peer support arena, it's very hard to be that token peer or that, a lot of organizations hire bunches of peers, but then they deploy them throughout the organization. So you may have 20 peers, and I say congratulations to you. But if you've put, one in the emergency room and one on inpatient and one in each of your clinics or whatever it is, however you're constructed, they're still alone. So perspective taking, mutual learning, building those supports and networking are the answers. So the next slide, please, so I won't keep repeating myself. Perspective taking. Keep in mind that reality is multifaceted. We all assume that we share the reality of the person we're with. If you think about it, you realize what a mistake that is. Because you just said something very clearly, and the other person responded in a way that made you think, I didn't say that. That's that reality thing again. Our reality is a construct of our experiences, our past, our skills, who we are, it's all of it. So of course, realities are not quite in lockstep. The peer supporter's reality is going to be different than the non-peer supporter's view of the world. Just is. So that perspective taking, that sharing, that, Peggy said it so well earlier, can happen when there are team meetings, there are opportunities for peers to shadow other peers. When you get peers to go to conferences like this, so that they're in virtual rooms at least, and in virtual chats with other peers, remind yourself that this is a journey of discovery. And trust me, having been on this journey, it is a wonderful opportunity to see the other side in a way that you might not have ever before. It's really a gift. And so when you're having one of those mumbly grumbly days where you can't imagine why anyone thought this was a good idea, and I'm talking both sides now, take a deep breath and cherish the gift you're given. It's a gift. Next slide, please. Mutual learning. I've said it before. You've heard it from Peggy. You'll hear it every time you go to a conference. All right. Supervision has some hierarchical elements to it, some power differential, right? Supervision has probably been given the responsibility for all those administrative things that have to be done. But it also can be level making. It can be mutual learning. It can be that gift. I never thought of it that way. Tell me that again. And I'm talking both sides now. Peer supporters can learn from non-peers, and non-peers certainly can learn from peer supporters and family youth advocates. It's mutual learning. It's not, I'm the boss of you. And in fact, again, in my research, the folks that they captured when they had their hand on the doorknob, they were out of there. Their most fervent complaint was that supervision was an opportunity for their supervisor to micromanage them, when their supervisor as a non-peer had no idea what they're talking about. But that anxiety of responsibility frequently, rears its ugly head when you're a supervisor and you go, I got to be all over this. I just got to be all over this because, because I'm responsible. So just keep that in mind. And my colleague, Dr. Edwards' 5 functions, give them their proper place. Because of time constraints, because frequently people don't have anything taken off their plate to make room for supervision. They only get to those administrative tasks. They only worry about getting that paper evaluation done because you got to have it in their file. They only worry about someone saying something because people's time and attendance is not what it should be. So allocate intentionally room for that education, the advocacy that might have to happen at your very place of work. And the evaluation, again, praise, polish, praise. I'm not going to say it because Peggy said it well. And just embrace that you learn from each other. Next slide, please, because I want to leave time for questions and answers. Kind of backing into this, respect the minority perspective. The lack of support and that isolation, which may go hand in hand with just being that minority on the team, will hamper inclusion, and you will begin to see the peers leaving if they can. If you're in a rural environment and there are no jobs, maybe folks will hang on, but you're going to see the peer drift. You're going to see that co-optation. They're going to throw up their hands and say, the only way I can work here is to diminish my gifts as a peer and just join the team. Next slide, please. In your place of work, create those opportunities for peer networking and peer interaction. It may be as simple as designating one office where the peers that you've deployed throughout your organization can come together. The beginning of work, lunch, end of work, because they're going to teach each other. They're going to talk to each other. They're going to vent with each other. Do whatever you can. If you don't have that opportunity, create brown bag lunches for all the peers where you mandate that they get to talk to each other. Get creative. Ask your peers, how can we do this? Inside and outside of work. Almost every community has some other peer thing going on, whether it's a clubhouse, whether it's a cafe. There are things, whether they're associations. At lunchtime, you're going to meet some of the regional peer support advocates. They know in your community where those places are. Make sure your peers get there. Non-peers do it, right? Social workers talk to social workers, nurses talk to nurses. You got it. Doctors pretty much only talk to doctors. I'm kidding. So take advantage of those outside of work things. We all need role models, and we all need supports. Supervisors need support, God knows, as much as anybody else. And if you're the CEO and you happen to be with us today, you know you need supports as well. It's very lonely at the top. Next slide. That respect for the peer role I went over. I'm not going to do it again. Next slide. This is kind of just a re-upping. The role clarity issues. You're going to fix those job descriptions. You're going to support that functioning. Next slide, please. I just said this, so I'm not going to have to say it again. Just to emphasize, though, peer networking, attendance at conferences like this, putting people together, it's going to make all the difference for you. Next slide. Apprenticeship. I just want to drive this home. We learn from others who do the work we do. And again, I don't even want to, I'm going to do it anyway. I just want to shout out what must have been behind the thinking when CMS decided that peers should be supervised by non-peers. Felt a little stigmatizing to me. I felt a little, boy, am I anxious about letting these folks loose to me. And it is what it is. It's changing. Peers are becoming supervisors, so they can do that apprentice stuff. It's a new profession. There's a lot to learn. There's a lot that we don't know. But you cannot effectively supervise somebody in a job that you have never done. Yes, training and familiarity makes a difference, certainly, please. But consider the dual supervision. If you're a non-peer and you've been tasked with supervising a peer, and you have an experienced peer somewhere in your organization, use them. Utilize their expertise. You can still sign off. You can be the titular supervisor, but help people learn from their peers, whether their peer is a social worker, nurse, psychologist, psychiatrist, occupational therapist, whatever it is, family advocate. That's who knows how to do this. Take advantage. Next slide. Whew. We're almost at time and I wanted questions. So take away the takeaways, because you heard this. You don't need to hear it again. I want to leave some time and a couple of spaces for questions.
Yeah, hello, Joanne. So a couple questions. We are running a little bit of short on time, but there was a question just around whether peers should get individual supervision, peer group supervision, or a combination. Do you have any thoughts on that?
All of the above. Individual supervision is always important because there are things that you're not going to talk about in a group. There just are. And, the praise, polish, praise thing is hard to do in a group. But group supervision provides what I always call the wisdom of the group. There's nothing like groups that come together and share what they're doing. You're going to learn from them. So if it's an either or, I don't know what I would pick. It depends on your organization. I might lean more to group supervision because then you have multiple supervisors in the room. Next question.
And thank you. I actually think we're gonna have to wrap up. So I have a couple just closing comments. First, I want to just thank everyone for attending. Perhaps there's a way that we will be able to respond to some of the questions that we didn't get to in the chat, but there's a lot of great resources folks put in the chat. So I want to thank Joanne for just the really informative presentation today. And thank you to all of the participants who took time out of your busy day to attend this session. Just a reminder that in order to earn the CE credit for participation, you have to complete the workshop evaluation, which will be emailed to you. This session is worth 1.25 CEs. To access the next session, please choose the title and click the link on the summit program that will get you there. And a recording of the session will be available within 30 days and posted to the PeerTAC website. I'm going to chat in that website right now so you have access to that if you did not before. And again, thank you for your participation. We hope that you will stay with us for the remainder of the day. Thank you, Joanne. Thank you for all of the tech support people on the call as well, Stephen. And we will see you again. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. It's been a pleasure being with you. I wish I could be in the room. Take care. Bye-bye.